Now, despite this trend over the last 40 years, you still have had a certain thread has still maintained itself through that period, which we might look at as the legacy or the remnants of the relativistic revolution that was brought about by Einstein. That though we've had a collapse in education, we've had a collapse in infrastructure, we've really lost our emphasis on science-driven programs like the moon program that we had under Kennedy and like what should be the Moon-Mars project that Lynn has introduced and we've been pushing. Despite the failure to continue on that pathway, this Einsteinian thread has maintained itself in some form. And as a result of that, we're now starting to see in the recent period some significant breakthroughs in the domain of what we might consider relativistic physics. And just to give people a sense of a couple of those breakthroughs and what they represent, and how were we to now move to bring these technologies online and to really make them the driver of our economy now, I think we could create the necessary margin of physical profit to get us at least through this current crisis and bring us up to the point where we'd have to actually carry out the next phase of revolution. And just to put it out there, because it gets to what you're bringing up with the Furtwängler principle, is that the next phase of revolution in science is going to have to be to move beyond what we might just simply consider as the Einstein paradigm of relativistic physics and go into a paradigm where the principles of Vernadsky, the fundamental principles of the universality of life and the universality of mind, actually become the perspective by which we approach science. That we no longer look at science and look at physics as an abiotic phenomena, but we actually approach it from the standpoint that the principles of mind and the principles of life are actually the principles which have to be mastered in order to master the physics of the universe. That's the next paradigm. But that's going to take some time. I mean, that's going to take really a generation or two, which are brought up in a classical culture, are brought up with the characteristic of mind typified by the kind of mind or the kind of culture that produced an Einstein.
Let's take a couple of cases. Let's take Wolfgang Köhler on the mind. Planck's relationship to Wolfgang Köhler on the mind. Number one. Then take the history of this thing. When did this decline in civilization occur? It occurred with the Bismarck's being discharged from the position of Chancellor of Germany. And his being discharged from that position was the cause of World War I. We have been in World War I ever since. We never stopped being in a world war. We are still in World War I, which started actually with Bismarck's being fired from the position of Chancellor in Germany. Now, then take the other side of Planck. Planck comes into the same period, and Einstein come into the same period, the 1890s. This is the turning point in history. Up to that point, you still had progress in European history. As long as Planck was Chancellor of Germany, you had this progress. There was no general war in Europe anymore. Bismarck had prevented that war once the Franco-Prussian War was out of the way, which was a mistake. Firing, Napoleon III was a great necessary achievement. But at that point, Germany's mission was get off the ego trip and immediately move to France to engage France and say, we got rid of your son of a bitch. And work with France. Because if we didn't work with France, if Germany didn't work with France, then the British were going to play the French and the French allies against Germany. And they were going to destroy Russia, they were going to destroy Austria as well, and they were going to conquer France as an ally of the British, which is with the problem right now today, is France is still an ally of the British, despite de Gaulle. And that's why they got rid of de Gaulle. So now that's only a part of it. Then you've got music. Well, music and the mind are also the same thing as part of physics. And therefore, this conception, you have to have a holistic conception, as you would call it. Now, take the case of what's so important about this thing with Wolfgang Köhler. Wolfgang Köhler was the one, as I've written, who convinced Planck to change his view of the human mind. Now, and today you still have Köhler's influence floating around, but Köhler is not really liked very much, and he's not very much taught anymore. He's still on the books. His names of his programs are still known and referenced. But what Köhler said is that the human mind does not function as by a collection of particles. It's not by addition. That the human mind is a unit. It functions as a unit, a dynamic unit. And it has various aspects and phases. And you have to see it in those terms. Now, what that most people today, and this is one of our big problems in science, is that the understanding of what Wolfgang Köhler convinced Planck of, which corresponds to the same kind of mental outlook that Einstein represented. Einstein and Köhler and Planck and so forth are all one piece. They were born in the 19th century. And they come out of the development in the course of the 19th century through into the 1920s, the end of the so-called World War I. And this conception of the mind by Köhler is absolutely true. And one of the greatest problems we have is that people are trained to believe in the additive conception of the mind. They believe that the mind deals with particles. And where the actual conception, which is implied by Köhler, is that the mind is a process, a unified process. It is not pieces. You can develop new aspects of the process, but the process is a process. And therefore, the idea of the additive conception of the mind that is based on interaction among particles, particle thinking. And what the Einstein Planck aspect was to go against that. The reason that Planck was converted to Köhler's viewpoint was because he recognized this validity. He recognized it from a scientific standpoint, to recognize that the way the mind is defined by the typical school education is intrinsically incompetent. And that is that legacy of believing in the way, this conception of the mind, which spills over into physical science. And it's only with great jerks and screams and so forth that even scientists are able to break through on some of the conception we're talking about here today. Because their mind doesn't agree with that. They come to agree with something because of experiments. And they believe these things because they can reproduce them experimentally, but they don't approach it from the standpoint of the understanding of the mind itself. And that's where the problem arises. And that's why I've insisted as much as I have on certain approaches, like on the question of language, why I insist that what Furtwängler accomplished and what his predecessors accomplished has to be taken into account in music and everything else. Because the failure to recognize what Furtwängler represents is a failure of the mind. It's a failure of the culture. The intellect of the culture is a failure. And what was done after World War II is even worse. What people believe today in terms of behavior, what they believe in entertainment, what they believe in music, what they believe in on everything is destructive. So that most people, only exceptional people with exceptional training, actually have effective human intelligence because they are trained and mistrained to believe in this particle view of everything, this extreme reductionist viewpoint. And what happens is you get scientists who say, yes, but, Billy Goat type, yes, but. because they say, yes, that's true, but, and they come in with the billy goat story, the reductionist conception of everything. Everything has to be reduced to reductionist terms. When we know, even from this period, a period of great growth of intellect, which is typified by the 1890s, but it was already typified by the effects of Lincoln's victory over the British during the 19th century. And what happened, you had a reversal of this. And you had a wave of British orchestrated assassinations of American presidents, not only Lincoln, but after him and before. So what we have in a British-dominated, a British imperial-dominated culture, a planetary culture, because the British took a position of being universal and said, we set a universal standard. And the universal standard is moral degeneracy. And the moral degeneracy, which is steeped in more and more into the educational institutions and the habits of our people, become clear when you understand the relationship between what Curler was and defined for Planck. That was a breaking point where the reversal, and then you find Curler is reduced to be a shadow of what he really was then, in terms of science. But this is the question. The human mind is disordered. It's disordered by the kind of culture which radiates from the British Empire, and it braces the planet to a large degree. People who are not stupid and corrupt are the exception. And they become the exception because they become specially trained and devoted to a scientific or related subject. As Furtwängler was devoted to a subject, and that was his genius. But only people who are devoted to a subject of this nature are able to survive intellectually in a British-dominated world, which is still going through World War I, which actually started in 1890 and has continued up to the present day. We're still living in World War I that the British launched successfully once Bismarck was successfully removed from his position as a controlling force in Germany. And so everything goes together with this. All these considerations are part of one fabric.